Thank you so much for this opportunity. So today's webinar is on cultural understanding of intimate partner violence, how to better support immigrants and newcomers. And I want to again say a big thank you to the PAR Committee for Women in Crisis, the Community Legal Education Association, and Manitoba Association of Women Shelter for giving us the chance to come and have this webinar and have some discussion. Before I begin my presentation, I want to mention that in this webinar, we will be using women referring to persons assigned a female sex at birth or persons who define and identify themselves as women. So in that sense, we are not excluding any group. Who am I and what do I bring to the conversation on IPV and newcomers or immigrants? I arrived in Canada as an immigrant in 2013 as an international student. For many international students, being in Canada with the goal of gaining a degree comes with isolation, cultural shock in attitudes, ways of doing things, etc. There's also the additional barriers of not even qualifying for some programs, or in the case where our accent is so different that sometimes you have to repeat yourself several times to get a point across, where to the point that you may feel even intimidated and you do not want to speak or you don't want to really engage, or you'd see people making faces or giggling when you're talking, that it has some impact on you. Essentially, such similar experiences often tend to make an impact as immigrants and newcomers navigate their settlement. I've had the privilege of working with some of the most amazing professors who shaped my already existing interest in immigration and integration in Canada. And as a researcher, most of my work tended to focus on highlighting barriers, gaps, and promising practices for different levels of institutions. But more importantly, drawing attention to the fact that decision, policies, and processes that we put in place and act on have impact on groups at different levels. Working alongside marginalized women has shaped how I understand their lived experiences and the day-to-day experiences in Canada, whether it was a project that involved Syrian women, Yazidi refugees, or even international students. The intersectionality of their multiple identities further adds to how they experience intimate partner violence, how they navigate abuse, and also if they can ask for help. There's this quote by Alexandra that really speaks to a lot of when it comes to and working with or understanding the complexities of newcomers as well as immigrants. And I read, it says, women are never just women. We have multiple cross-cutting identities revolving around race, ethnicity, class, sexual orientation, age, and ability. So supporting and engaging with immigrants and newcomers, first of all, requires an intersectional lens, which examines the links between different structures of power and how those links position this group, where the group is immigrants and newcomers, and how this group also position themselves based on the multiple and complex identities constituting either their race, class, age. There's a need to recognize the intercategorical connections, that is the differences within one group of women. So whether you are having clients that are Muslim immigrant women or whether they are Indian Muslim women, there's a need to recognize that intercategorical connections or differences that would exist among that very group, as well as also paying attention to intercategorical connections, where we are also being considerate of and being conscious that differences exist among multiple categories that exist among various groups and classes of immigrants. So then whether it is services you are providing for Syrian women or Ghanaian women or Nigerian women, that these multiple identities that define their sense of self can to some extent create varying levels of barriers in accessing services and programs. So there is much growing diversity in Canada. Canada has experienced different waves of migration since the 19th century. And according to Stats Canada, Canada's foreign-born population will increase dramatically and could reach between 25 and 30% of the national population by 2036. So essentially, when it comes to the service sector, there's more numbers of immigrants coming in. There's more numbers of newcomers coming in to settle in Canada, and not just Canada, but then even if you look at the numbers that are arriving in Manitoba, that sense of diversity is very broad. The shifting proportion of immigrants coming to Canada from a varied number of countries signals that we'll be seeing a more culturally and linguistically diverse Canada than ever before. Immigrants also arrive in Canada under different immigration programs. So whether if they're coming in as refugees, they come in as government-assisted, private-sponsored, or the blended visa program, or they are coming in as temporary resident visas or under temporary resident visas, or they are coming in even as economic class immigrants. Essentially, these programs have the immigration program under which they come through would determine what programs and services they may be eligible for, resources, knowledge, and access, among others. For folks working in the gender-based violence sector and or settlement sector, oftentimes the clients you may be engaging with would have varying levels of education, communication skills, dependent health conditions, among others. So then that would mean that in as much as we have universal approach in supporting clients, when it comes to the diversity of the immigrant population, certain times some of the programs have to be catered or created in a way that it meets their specific needs. What is intimate partner violence? This can be defined as a pattern of intentional abusive behavior used by one partner within an intimate relationship against the other to gain power and control. Oftentimes, when the concept of intimate partner violence is addressed, the two main elements or factors that are highlighted are power and control, because essentially it is a weapon that the abuser uses to intimidate the other. For immigrants in particular, this would also include migration-related abuse, because oftentimes it happens that when there's the immigration process, it could be that women often are the dependents on their husband's application. So that becomes a tool that is often used to intimidate them or determine that you can either do this or you can do that. Intimate partner violence isn't only physical, it can also be emotional, it can be sexual, it can even be a form of harassment. According to World Health Organization, intimate partner violence is also a domestic violence, and it is the most common form of violence against women worldwide. It is evident in family violence. There are cases where the abuser is not just even their very intimate partner. It could be other family members that are perpetrating this violence. It can also be a dating violence and spousal abuse. So what are some of the common realities of immigrants and newcomers in Canada? Several studies that have been conducted point out that when you're looking at intimate partner violence against immigrant and refugee women, there are several risk factors that increases based on the vulnerability that this group carries. So for instance, we can look at post-migration strain and trauma. Essentially, for refugees in particular, if they are coming in after they've experienced some form of war, some form of war abuse, whether it is rape or witness an act of violence against others, this has certain strain on them or has implications in their settlement process in Canada, as well as the challenge of even going through the migration process, where there's the processing of documents, having to engage with lawyers, having to think of even the finances that you are arriving in a new country with. Another common reality for immigrants and newcomers in Canada is the change in social networks and support. With this, oftentimes, because of the distance that most immigrants are coming from to in Canada, there's the loss of family connections. There's a loss of that sense of community and belonging. There's a loss of support structures that were present for them back at home. In addition to this is also the social and geographical isolation. Even in the cases where you arrive in Canada and there is some level of your ethnic groups being in Canada, so you can participate in some cultural practices, oftentimes that isolation may come about when your extended family is not close by, or often when new arrival families do not understand or navigate and do not understand how to navigate the transportation system. So then it becomes hard to engage or go out and meet with others. With also the harsh weather conditions, oftentimes it takes time to settle in it. So that isolation can often build up. Then we have economic insecurity. This results from not being able to work due to, one, for most immigrants and newcomers, your foreign credentials aren't recognized in Canada, or you do not have a Canadian education. So oftentimes you may have to leave your degree behind or go back to school or decide to take on jobs that do not meet any of your skill set. There's also that power balance that sometimes can change, where oftentimes for those that are married, the husband is often the breadwinner whilst the wife stays home and takes care of children. But now that they are in Canada, there could be a change in role where the wife may find a job much faster and the husband has to spend time at home rather now taking care of the kids. So that change in relationship responsibilities or power balance sometimes may cause some form of rift or uncomfortability in the relationships for most immigrants and newcomers in Canada. So now I'll talk about some of the dynamics of intimate partner violence. We talked about that idea of power and control that is central to intimate partner violence. So this field depicts the unique challenges faced by immigrant women and newcomers in violent relationships, in addition to tactics that an abusive partner uses to keep their victim in a relationship. As I mentioned, the ultimate goal of intimate partner violence is to gain power and control. So if we look at the outermost part of the circle, we realize that for most immigrants and newcomers, the focus is not just on the abuse, but it often starts with their migration process, them thinking about child protection. What does that mean in Canada? Them looking at that sense of holding their family together, accessing mental health and social services. If you come a bit inner to, that is the post-migration, then oftentimes in the previous slide, as I mentioned, then there's either role reversal. For those that English is not their first language, then there's the language barrier that they would have to deal with. There's also discrimination that most immigrants face in the Canadian society from members in the society. There's also the fact that for immigrants and newcomers, we constitute part of the minority population. So then that sometimes have implications for access to services, programs, and what you qualify for. Then we can look in more closely how these institutional factors sometimes are used as weapons and used by weapons by the abuser. So there's that intimidation or using their children as a tool that if you do not do this or that, the kids will be taken away from you, or I will report you. So these factors are often dynamic based on the power control of either the abuser using it to intimidate the victim in most cases. Now, the prevalence of intimate partner violence. So for most research out there, oftentimes it's pointed out that even with the statistics that we have available when we are looking at the case rates, there is a possibility that these numbers are much higher than we actually have reported. And for immigrants and newcomers, the numbers are even much lower because one is there's a consideration of, does this have any implication on my status in Canada? Intimate partner violence and its effects are important to consider just as much as understanding the varied experiences between groups is crucial. A better understanding of the diversity of newcomers and immigrants helps us to develop the most appropriate responses, services, programs, or preventions related to IPV. So if we look at the charts, the snapshot chart, this just gives us an idea of that. Even if looking at the immigrant population as a whole, the diversity of the different groups, there are different rates at which they experience intimate partner violence. According to research by Stats Canada, a woman in Canada is killed by her intimate partner approximately every 6 days. On a given day in Canada, more than 3,300 women and children are forced to sleep in an emergency shelter to escape domestic violence. And every night, about 200 women are turned away because the shelters are full. In police-reported spousal homicides that occurred in Canada, more than 85% of the victims were women. So essentially, if we are thinking about what resources we have in our own agencies and organizations to support intimate partner violence clients, we realize that they are definitely not enough. And even if there's specific ones that are being created, are staff getting the right equipment and training to be able to support these vast numbers of people experiencing intimate partner violence. With contributing factors of intimate partner violence among newcomers and immigrants, oftentimes it so happens that hierarchy is normalized in relationships even before they integrate into Canada, where now you get into that sense of cultural shock of the level of equality that should exist in relationship. So oftentimes when one is abused, they are taking it that it is a form of correction that is being given to them. They have to be submissive. They have to understand that maybe they did something wrong. In other cases too, women are often objectified. They are taught to be submissive, especially to men, while men are taught to dominate. So you would see in most typical immigrant household that, for instance, when it comes to doing housework, women take on that responsibility. When it comes to either serving food, the man has to be served first before the woman. So that ideology or that culture of humbleness that women have to play in relationship tends to sometimes become tools that are used by the abuser to oftentimes dominate the partner to be submissive or to more or less build some level of low self-esteem, self-blame when they are going through some experiences or signals that this is a form of violence. Barriers to reporting. So even though most immigrants who are experiencing IPV may decide that they want to actually go ahead and report and get some assistance, oftentimes there are several challenges. And one of the most common or predominant reasons why women will not want to report is they are staying for their children. One, being an immigrant, you are always or oftentimes thinking that any point in time, you can be sent home. Any point in time, you may lose your children because you do not typically understand what parent and child relationship may look like in Canada. So for most women, if they are going through some form of abuse, there's that consideration that I want to stay at home so that I can be able to protect my children from the abuse that is going on at home. So that is why most women will decide not to report. Then there's the immigration status, especially for economic immigrants or even for refugees, that their application is based on their partners. In most cases, they are without them actually getting the full paperwork done or completed, then there's that fear that any point in time, the partner can report them and the process will be stopped and they would have to go back home. There's also the language and communication barrier which most immigrants face. From Statistics Canada, they indicate that there's a high statistics of over 50% of newcomers that come to Canada not having English as their first language. And oftentimes, language classes tend to have long waiting lists. So with women facing abuse, most often, unless they have that level of confidence to engage in what little English they can speak, oftentimes language becomes a barrier that makes them less hesitant to proceed. There's also that issue of advocacy that has come up from others that have pointed out that even in cases with those with little language experience or even accent, there's the indication that sometimes the attitudes that they receive when seeking help because of their accent and language, it puts them in a situation where after that first engagement, they do not want to go back. There's also lack of access of information and resources to support, especially in multiple language. So for those that may be tech savvy, that may want to go online to find information, it may happen that oftentimes they cannot read in other language, except for instance, maybe if their own local language. So without having that option of seeing information and resources in different language, then there's a barrier that they would face. There's the low level of education, where there is the lack of understanding of, is what I'm going through intimate partner violence, or is it part of what has been normalized so much for me that it is not really an issue that I may have to follow up on? There's also the lack of the Canadian systems. There's the fear of police and the justice system. And oftentimes it comes in with, my children might be taken away from me. Something may be said that I may not be able to understand or interpret, or I may misinterpret something, and that could cause more issues for me. And the fear of police oftentimes would come for immigrants, that especially those that have gone through some form of war, where the power of police has been abused to the point that they carry that bit of mistrust still with them, even whilst settling in Canada. So how to better support immigrants and newcomers? There are a number of areas where most work is needed to mitigate some of these structural barriers and improve access to services and programs for newcomers and immigrants experiencing intimate partner violence. First of all, it's important to acknowledge that survivors are experts of their own experience and healing journey. What does this mean? This means that when clients come in and are sharing their experiences or opening up their experiences, there's that high level of vulnerability that they carry with them. So then that active listening from staff, it is very essential and crucial. And always bearing in mind that that could be the last time this client may come in. So making them most comfortable, giving them that respect of confidentiality, or taking their issues that they relate seriously, helps them to create a safe space to build that relationship, and also for you to support them in their healing journey. Then increased awareness and understanding of community resources. For those working in the gender-based violence sector and even the settlement sector, there's the need to understand and know where the resources are to help your client. So then there's the need for that collaboration and connection with most often settlement agencies, because they are the first direct contacts that immigrants have in arrival in Canada. So building that relationship with them to know what resources they have and what resources you also have to connect and support each other will be very beneficial to your clients, and also make their processes that they go through more fluid and smooth. Then translation services. Resources have to be built in language capacity. And what this is driving at is there are multiple languages that most immigrants learn. As much as Canada has funding for English and French classes, there are also long wait times. So for those that need immediate assistance and are not comfortable in communicating in English, there should be a process in place to support, whether you are getting professional interpreters or whether you are getting someone that speaks their own language to support them to interpret their experiences is very essential. Using children, family members shouldn't be the way to go, because of the desperation that there isn't anyone that can help us to support them or translate that communication. But it is crucial that you are using more or less people that have been trained in interpretation skills and understand the confidentiality and the sensitivity with which clients that experience IPV may be going through. Also, it's important to pay attention to specific communication patterns and style. There are some groups that some keywords are essential in their vocabulary. So using that to also communicate and relate back to them helps to support them better. Then education on legal rights. With this, most immigrants do not have a better understanding of the Canadian legal system, and more so when you are already experienced some form of abuse, you are overwhelmed, you are stressed, and you are exposed to a whole different set of legal language or a whole set of processes, meetings that you have to go through. Breaking this down is essential for clients, and also indicating at every point in time when professionals are being brought in through the process what their responsibility is, what the roles are, and what it is that they are able to support clients with. Oftentimes, there have been cases where newcomers have mentioned they went to the shelter with the expectation that this support could be given to them, this could be done, and it turned out that that was beyond what the capacity of shelters. So sometimes it is, not sometimes, it is actually important to let, when clients come in, know the extent of support that they can receive and which other additional support that can be coordinated to be provided for them. There's also the need for increased awareness about legal protections to be made available to newcomers and immigrants. For ongoing training for those that work in the gender-based violence sector, as well as the settlement sector or service sector, which supports immigrants and newcomers, there's a need for a lot of training on anti-racism practices, diversity and inclusion, what intersectionality means, and also using a gender-based analysis plus in your project and service development, as well as delivery. And here are some additional resources. And for the questions, I believe we would wait for Dr. Amber to finish her section, then we would go into questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Sally. So I'm just going to share my screen here. Okay. So if it's okay here, I'm just going to kind of piggyback off of what Sally's discussed in terms of practical steps on how to support. And kind of what I'm going to do is looking at how to support from a mindset. And that mindset is one that practices cultural humility, which involves reflection, critical analysis, and coming from a place of curiosity and inquiry as opposed to judgment. So what I just like to kind of start off with is going again to that big question. So how might we as service providers better support immigrants and newcomers who are or who are perceived to be experiencing intimate partner violence? So my response to that would be practicing cultural humility through things like critical analysis, reflection, and again, coming from a place of curiosity. So then the question becomes, how might we practice cultural humility, which encompasses reflection and critical analysis? How might we practice cultural humility to better support immigrants and newcomers? And so this is where I'd like to start, kind of with practicing some of that critical analysis or going through what that could look like. And that I'll start that with the assertion of intimate partner violence is on the rise in newcomer communities. So I'm going to use this statement, intimate partner violence is on the rise in newcomer communities, because a colleague of mine was in conversation with someone where this was mentioned, that intimate partner violence is on the rise in newcomer communities. And it got me thinking, A, what does that mean? And B, how do we interpret that in relation to how we interpret our clients that we're working with that are newcomers and immigrants? So if you'll humor me, I'd like to do a bit of a poll, and it's just an agree or disagree. So the statement is, or the assertion is, I have heard or read that intimate partner violence is on the rise in newcomer communities. So again, I have heard or read that intimate partner violence is on the rise in newcomer communities. Agree or disagree? Okay, so it looks like the majority, 69%, would agree that they've heard or read that intimate partner violence is on the rise in newcomer communities, whereas 31% disagree. And I would say that to the 69%, that would make complete sense. There are many studies, much research out there that suggests that intimate partner violence is on the rise in newcomer communities. That said, what if that statement was potentially misleading? what if it wasn't necessarily that that statement is false, but that it's oversimplified and lacking nuance? So maybe what we can do is take that statement and make it a broader one to think about whether, to think about intimate partner violence being on the rise in newcomer communities. So just taking a step back, another poll, and again, this is going to be agree or disagree. I have heard or read that intimate partner violence is on the rise in Canada. So again, agree or disagree, another poll. I have heard or read that intimate partner violence is on the rise in Canada. Okay, so 85% of people would agree that they have heard or read that intimate partner violence is on the rise in Canada. Again, this makes sense. There's a lot of research to suggest that intimate partner violence is on the rise in Canada. Now, if both of these statements are true, if intimate partner violence is on the rise, if we've heard that it is on the rise in newcomer communities as well as in Canada, then what that might mean is that the statement that intimate partner violence in newcomer communities is on the rise is one that loses a lot of context and can be misleading. What a more accurate statement might be that intimate partner violence is on the rise in Canada, including in newcomer communities, or that we've heard that intimate partner violence is on the rise in Canada, including within newcomer communities. And although that seems like a very small distinction, it can be quite a one that influences how we might think about newcomers and violence, for example, especially when we think of different areas that people are coming from and what we might see in the media. Making that distinction that intimate partner violence is on the rise in Canada as a whole, as well as within newcomer communities, can alter kind of how that statement might influence our thinking. And so I'm just going to break this down one more or a little bit further and do another poll. And the poll will be, again, agree or disagree. Over the past 15 plus years, people in general are becoming more aware of intimate partner violence. Now, when I say be aware, I'm referring to being aware of what intimate partner violence is, what our rights are, what it can look like. And when I'm talking about how they're becoming aware, this could be because of IPV awareness campaigns through government or nonprofits. It could be through social media, internet, things being more accessible, but just in general, over the past 15 plus years, do you agree or disagree that people are becoming more aware of intimate partner violence? So 97% would agree that people are becoming more aware of what intimate partner violence is. So in that sense, if this is fact, so if awareness has increased in general around intimate partner violence, then it might not be that there is a statistical increase in intimate partner violence among newcomer communities, but in fact, what it might mean is that people are recognizing and reporting intimate partner violence more within newcomer communities and within Canada as a whole. And so the reason why I like to break that down is so that we can kind of think of what does that mean in general. I'm going to just break it down one last time. And the statement intimate partner violence is on the rise in newcomer communities. So this last piece, what it makes me think, if I'm thinking critically, it makes me wonder how many different definitions and ways of perceiving and understanding intimate partner violence exist globally. To state that intimate partner violence is on the rise in newcomer communities might imply that all newcomer communities have the exact same perception and understanding of what intimate partner violence looks like. And coincidentally, it's the exact same as how we would view intimate partner violence in, or how North Americans, how let's say Canadians or Americans might view intimate partner violence. And so this idea that if we do a basic research analysis, for example, we can see that not every Western government and the communities within those governments have the same perception and understanding or view of what intimate partner violence is. And so, of course, if even within our own, within communities, the perception or viewpoint of what intimate partner violence is changes, then globally it would be different as well. And so that's something just to consider. Part of having cultural understanding means recognizing that the Western concept of intimate partner violence does not necessarily fit into all cultures and communities. So again, pushing our worldview and biases onto others could create a sort of single story narrative, which is something that we'd like to prevent. So to kind of give an idea of what a single story narrative might look like, I'm just going to show a quick video here on, let's see here. Here we go. Okay. And this is just 3.5 minutes. Bear with me. And I would suggest anybody go and review this as well if you're interested, because it's a great talk by Chimamanda Adichie.
I started to write about things I recognized. Now, I loved those American, and his family was very poor. Don't you know people like him? Was that
Sorry, it was ready.
And so we had, as was the norm, living domestic help who would often come from nearby rural villages. So the year I turned 8, we got a new houseboy. His name was Fide. The only thing my mother told us about him was that his family was very poor. My mother sent yams and rice and our old clothes to his family. And when I didn't finish my dinner, my mother would say, "Finish your food. Don't you know people like Fide's family have nothing?" So I felt enormous pity for Fide's family. Then one Saturday, we went to his village to visit. And his mother showed us a beautifully patterned basket made of dyed raffia that his brother had made. I was startled. It had not occurred to me that anybody in his family could actually make something. All I had heard about them was how poor they were, so that it had become impossible for me to see them as anything else but poor. Their poverty was my single story of them. Years later, I thought about this when I left Nigeria to go to university in the United States. I was 19. My American roommate was shocked by me. She asked where I had learned to speak English so well and was confused when I said that Nigeria happened to have English as its official language. She asked if she could listen to what she called my tribal music and was consequently very disappointed when I produced my tape of Mariah Carey. She assumed that I did not know how to use a stove. What struck me was this: she had felt sorry for me even before she saw me. Her default position toward me as an African was a kind of patronizing, well-meaning pity. My roommate had a single story of Africa, a single story of catastrophe. In this single story, there was no possibility of Africans being similar to her in any way, no possibility of feelings more complex than pity, no possibility of a connection as human equals. I must say that before I went to the US, I didn't consciously identify as African. But in the US, whenever Africa came up, people turned to me, never mind that I knew nothing about places like Namibia. But I did come to embrace this new identity, and in many ways, I think of myself now as African, although I still get quite irritable when Africa is referred to as a country, the most recent example being my otherwise wonderful flight from Lagos 2 days ago, in which there was an announcement on the Virgin flight about their charity walk in India, Africa, and other countries. So after I had spent some years in the US as an African, I began to understand my roommate's response to me. If I had not grown up in Nigeria, and if all I knew about Africa were from popular images, I too would think that Africa was a place of beautiful landscapes, beautiful animals, and incomprehensible people fighting senseless wars, dying of poverty and AIDS, unable to speak for themselves, and waiting to be saved by a kind white foreigner. I would see Africans in the same way that I, as a child, had seen Fide's family.
Okay, thank you. So what I find really, I think, insightful about that talk is this idea of a single story narrative and how a single story narrative can really impact the way that we work with clients and the way that we view people who are unfamiliar from us. And so I'm not sure if anybody knows where these pictures are, these images are from. If they do, please feel free to type it in the chat if you know where these images are. But I'll just quickly tell a short story of a family that I worked with when I worked with Citizenship and Immigration Canada, and they had come from Syria, Damascus in Syria, and I remember this is one of those moments where something kind of sticks with you. And I remember sitting in their house. They had just newly moved to this apartment, being settled in Ontario. And I remember the young man, he was there with his mom, and he spoke some English. She didn't speak any. She spoke Arabic. And he sat there, and over tea, he started telling me a story about Syria. And with almost this urgency that I hear what he's saying about how Syria was before the war in 2011. So he talked about the delicious cuisine. He talked about the generosity of people. He talked about how inexpensive things were. Talked about how you would be up like all night. People would be walking around, women, how it was safe. He talked about the nature, which you can see in the upper image here, which I believe is Latika. I could be saying that wrong, sorry, pronouncing it wrong. And he talked about the architecture and how beautiful the architecture was. And so these images are images of Syria, Latika, Damascus, Aleppo. These are images that when I knew him before this conversation as a refugee from Syria, these were not the images I had in my mind when I thought of Syria. What I thought of were these images. So I thought of the buildings that have been demolished by bombs and fires, and the rubble, and the lives of people suffering. And these were often the images. If you do just a basic Google search, other than you'll see some images before and after, most of the images that come up are images after the war. And so what realization I had in that moment was, I need to probably do more of my own learning in terms of someone's culture and history. So more of a meaningful delve into what their culture and history looks like. And also that not everybody comes to Canada because they want to. Many do, and many come because they have to for safety. And so this idea of a single story narrative was something that was really important for him to break. And he assumed right when he thought that I did have that single story narrative, because when he talked about Syria, before he spoke about Syria, I would not have had these images in my head. And so when we're talking about things like cultural humility and cultural and reflection and critical analysis, these are all aspects of how, breaking that single story narrative and understanding the danger of that and challenging what our biases might be really come into play. So again, cultural humility, I'll go through this. So we have about 10 minutes, try to be fast here. So we'll talk about culture briefly. This will all be quite brief. Cultural humility, the 3 tenets of cultural humility, and culturally relevant trauma-informed training. And this is a topic we could probably talk about for days. So unfortunately, things have to be brief in a shorter time span. So what is culture? Culture is a system developed by a community or society that gives order to the way that people see the world. It's constructed and learned patterns of beliefs, attitudes, norms, and values that influence how people view relationships, live, and organize their world. Another big piece about culture is that it's static and can change over time. So really what culture is the things that bring us meaning in our lives, whether that be art, whether that be our attitudes towards things, whether that be what we value in our belief systems. These are things that organize our world and that bring meaning to our lives. And that's really what culture is about. So just kind of a personal reflection to think about while I'm speaking is, how do you describe your cultural identity? What is the most important part of your cultural identity? Is it your traditions, your values, your art, your cuisine, your religious practices? Is it something else? And does your cultural identity change depending on who you're with and what you're involved in? Also, can you see that it has changed with age and experience? So just something to kind of consider when we're talking about reflection, especially. So because cultural practices and beliefs are so diverse, the concept and practice of power and control is diverse and differs based on cultural values and norms. So again, this is also power and control is diverse. It's not necessarily only the way that we might understand power control through a Western lens. So here's a culture wheel that I would encourage anybody to kind of look up and review yourself, because there's a lot of information on this. But what it's showing is how this cultural wheel is representing how cultural norms, values, institutions can reinforce violence against women. And so you might look at this and say, well, courts, the courts, when we think of culture and we think of courts and how it could reinforce violence against women, if you are a white middle-class woman, then you might have a very different experience with courts and with police and with media than, let's say, if you are an Indigenous woman or a woman of color, a woman who is, let's say, a sex worker or experiencing homelessness. So these sorts of, this culture wheel kind of shows how different aspects, power and control affects us differently based on our diversity, based on our culture, based on our experiences. So cultural humility, what exactly is that? So historically, as helping professionals within the field, we would focus on cultural competency. What we have seen is that there's such diversity in cultures and their ever-changing nature that we've now decided to move towards cultural humility as an approach to understanding culture better. So cultural competency versus cultural humility, what's the difference? They're similar in a lot of ways. Really, cultural competency suggests sort of a mastery with an emphasis on acquiring knowledge. What is different about cultural humility is it more so suggests introspection, person-centered care with an emphasis on lifelong learning. So this is kind of a cute little example, I think so. So an example of cultural competency, you're Japanese, you must love sushi, versus cultural humility, you're Japanese, how do you feel about sushi? So the cultural competency piece shows an understanding that in Japan, sushi is eaten, it comes from Japan. So there's an understanding of that, there's an acquiring of knowledge, and almost a mastery, you could suggest, of knowledge. What the other one is suggesting is that there's still that inquiry of knowledge, but from a place of curiosity as opposed to assumption, understanding that even within newcomer communities or within communities, not everyone is going to ascribe to the same things, have the same values, have the same interests. And so it will be different. So what the second kind of comic piece shows is this idea of asking questions, coming from a place of curiosity as opposed to a place of assumption. So what does cultural humility mean? It is a lifelong process of self-reflection, reflective practice, and self-critique. So what is reflective practice? What reflective practice is really examining one's own feelings, thoughts, and actions, and how they impact our clients and ourselves as practitioners. So if I'm committing to reflective practice, what I'm committing to is examining on a continuous and regular basis, examining my thinking, my feeling, and my actions, and thinking about how that then impacts my clients and how that impacts my work as a practitioner. What else does cultural humility involve? The practitioner individual learning about another's culture, and also starting with the examination again of yourself and your own beliefs and your own cultural identities, and how your own understanding of those things will then impact how you understand another individual's culture. And again, cultural humility is not a practice, it's a mindset that demonstrates respectful inquiry and empathy. So really what cultural humility is, if you want to just kind of break it down to its very bare basics, it's about being teachable. So we're learning from the impact of systems, we're learning from our trusted colleagues, we're learning from ourselves, and we're learning from our clients as well. And so when we are being teachable, one really important piece to being teachable is being open to making mistakes. And so from a lens of cultural humility, mistakes would be seen as growth as opposed to failure. So again, another little cute comic. How's my cultural competency? Your humility is working. So really, I mean, probably self-explanatory, but the fact that the person is asking, how's my cultural competency, is an example of cultural humility. And so that's why their response is, well, your humility is working. I think that's kind of a very simple and cute way to put it. Okay, so now just looking at 3 tenets of cultural humility. So the first is lifelong learning and self-reflection, which I think I've probably gone over and over with. And this self-reflection piece is really, really important. I would say it's kind of vital when you consider the diversity of worldviews of clients that you're working with who are immigrants and newcomers. So we all come with our own worldview. So for example, my worldview all of our worldviews are based on our experiences and our environment. So my worldview is going to be different from, let's say, my brother's worldview. However, and that's because we've had different experiences. However, because we've had a similar environment, it might not be vastly different. Now, my worldview may be a lot more different compared to someone who's experienced chronic homelessness for the majority of their life. So we have very different experiences, most likely. We might have, in the grand scheme of things, the same environment, but on more of a micro level, a very different environment. And then to take that a step further, my worldview is going to differ from someone who was born and raised in Iraq or Venezuela, or in Nepal. And this is again because our worldviews are impacted by or are influenced by our experiences and our environment. So the lifelong learning and self-reflection, when you consider how different all of our worldviews are, is quite a vital tenet. And part of this is just asking genuine and open-ended questions, leading with curiosity instead of judgment, and accepting that we're always learning. We're learning as we go, but we're lifelong learners, so we're always learning. We're never an expert in anything. The second tenet would be mitigating power imbalances. So recognizing your own power and privilege and not exploiting your power, avoiding unnecessary assumptions, encouraging clients to share their knowledge, and accepting clients as experts in their own lives, and remaining aware and humble about our own privilege. And then the third tenet would be recognizing power imbalances inherent. The third tenet would be institutional accountability, which is recognizing power imbalances inherent in institutions and assuming institutional accountability to mitigate them. Now, obviously, that's again more of a macro level aspect. This can be done through knowledge building and by upholding and valuing diverse, person-centered, culturally appropriate beliefs and practices within an organization. So what could culturally relevant trauma-informed training look like that practices cultural humility? So part of, I think the big kind of pieces that we have to that would be that it would be critical, that it would be challenging in the sense that it would be challenging our own biases, that it would be understanding, and it would be introspective. So again, that introspective, that self-reflection. So it is important that it builds service providers' capacity to give care in a way that acknowledges and respects and integrates their clients' values, traditions, norms, practices. And it views relationships through a culturally relevant, trauma-informed lens. So components of training could be a review of relevant definitions and collaboration on a shared language. It could be self-assessments on navigating conflict, recognizing implicit bias, thinking with humility, understanding the intersect between trauma and culture. It could be self-awareness and introspective activities. Components of the training could also include cognitive strategies for debiasing, discussions on shame and defensiveness as a helping professional. And this one can be really big, especially when we assume the role of having to always be the expert. And as Sally said, clients are the experts in their own lives. And from practicing cultural humility, mistakes are growth. And so it can be really difficult, but that is an important aspect, is discussions on shame and defensiveness. Discussions on implicit bias and the intersect between racism and privilege, and debunking myths through critical analysis. So I think I'll just end off quickly with kind of, over the last 15 years, some of what I've really been taught by others and my experiences in the work that I've done, is not to assume that my way of thinking is the only way or the best way. That I think, and that alternatives are not possible. That was a really big piece, I think, for me and for a lot of people who kind of delve into this lens of cultural humility. Just because I have things my way and I do things in a certain way does not mean it's the right approach, the best approach, or the only approach. And it doesn't mean alternatives aren't possible. Also, into understanding that my teachings, what has been passed down to me from my family and my formal education, are not universal teachings. So not necessarily the norms and attitudes and beliefs that have been passed down, for example, from my formal education, will not necessarily be the same as what others will experience through their formal education. So again, even our teachings can differ drastically. And which makes sense. There's 8 billion people in the world. So we also need to understand that we will interact with things that are unfamiliar, with people that are unfamiliar, with traditions and norms that are unfamiliar. And that should be expected because of the globalized nature of the world that we live in. How we can grow most from these encounters is to let the unfamiliar challenge our own ways of thinking. That's really kind of a piece that I got from my work, is that just letting these encounters challenge my own ways of thinking. And in doing so, we might be able to recognize our own biases and assumptions and find practical approaches to seeking culturally relevant alternative service provision. So again, in order to challenging our biases, in order to provide culturally relevant alternative service provision. And then arguably, this is essential for working with anyone with newcomer and immigrants to commit to practicing cultural humility and reflection. I would say that that is really an essential aspect if you want to better support and understand clients and newcomers. Coming from that place of cultural humility and reflection is key. And I'm going to stop there because I think we've gone a little over. And yeah, thank you so much for listening in, and I'm looking forward to the Q&A.